So the first question itself is a diagram question. See, like I told you, diagram questions are very, very important. I think you'll have to spend an entire day or two before your NEET exam in going through all the important diagrams. So they, like how it is shown here, they directly pick up a diagram from the textbook and they ask you to label the parts. So this is the diagram of the human respiratory system. So as you can see, the first part, which is labeled as A over here, represents your windpipe. It is called your trachea. What is B over here? The B represents your pleural membrane, the protective coverings of your lungs. And C represents the sac-like structure, which are the regions of exchange of gases. And D represents the muscular disc, which is referred to. I hope you can see what I'm writing. If not, please let me know. So diaphragm is the muscle, the skeletal muscle disc, the dome-shaped muscle that you see at the bottom of your respiratory system. So, but the options given, now you know that once you have identified what the different parts are, so that's why you should be thorough with the diagram. Once you have identified the parts, we can go through the options. They say a trachea is a long tube supported by complete cartilaginous rings. Now this is incorrect because actually it is supported by C-shaped cartilaginous rings. Here they are saying that it is complete cartilaginous rings. So it is not complete. It has to be flexible at the same time. It shouldn't close on itself. It shouldn't collapse. So it should be C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. And you also know that the cartilage that makes up these rings are the hyaline cartilage. And it is also good to know that there are about 16 to 20 rings present in your trachea. Then says B says pleural membrane surrounding the ribs. It says it doesn't surround your ribs, it actually surrounds your lungs. It's a double membrane structure, and you know that between your pleural membrane there is a fluid that protects mechanical damage due to friction, and that fluid is referred to as the pleural fluid. C says alveoli, thin-walled vascular bag-like structures. Yes. So this is the correct option here, alveoli, which are thin-walled muscular bag-like structures where exactly the process of gaseous exchange takes place. D says lower end of the lungs diaphragm pulls it down during inspiration. It's not the lower end of the lungs. It's basically not a part of the lungs at all, isn't it? And it doesn't pull the lung. It's not like the diaphragm is connected to the lung, and when the diaphragm becomes flat, it doesn't pull on the lung. All of you should remember one thing. When does the diaphragm become flat? The diaphragm becomes flat, it flattens during inspiration. Inspiration is also referred to as inhalation, breathing in, isn't it? And when you breathe in, the diaphragm has to become flat. So when the diaphragm becomes flat, you know that the volume in your lung increases and the pressure decreases in comparison to the atmospheric pressure. And that's how the air gushes into your lungs. All right. So here the correct answer is option C. The next question says mammalian lungs contain an enormous number of minute alveoli. So why do we have so many alveoli in our lungs? This is a very simple question. The only reason we have so many alveoli in our lung is to offer a greater surface area for diffusion of gases. More the number of alveoli, greater is the blood supply. You all know there is a wall of the alveolus that is richly supplied with capillary network across which the exchange of gases takes place. So more the surface area, greater is the diffusion of gases and greater is the efficiency of our respiratory system. So having enormous number of alveoli is to ensure that there is greater surface area. Which is the correct sequence of air passage, they're saying, which is the correct sequence of air passage in man. The first one says nasal cavity, pharynx, trachea, larynx. They're saying larynx after trachea. It cannot be, isn't it? See the second option. First nasal cavity, then pharynx, then after pharynx you have larynx, then trachea, then bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. So this is the correct statement. See, also you all have to remember, before entering the nasal cavity, you have nostrils. So nostrils are the openings of the nasal cavity. And then after air enters into your nasal cavity, it doesn't directly go into your pharynx, okay? It passes through a small passage called nasopharynx. Nasopharynx is the part of your nasal cavity which is in communication with pharynx. Pharynx is actually the back of your mouth, or it is also simply referred to as the throat. So nostrils, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, pharynx, and then from your throat, it doesn't directly go to the larynx. There's opening of the larynx. All of you should remember the opening of your sound box is called glottis. And you all are familiar that the glottis on top of it, it has a lid-like structure. The lid-like structure is referred to as the epiglottis. So epiglottis is the lid that is sitting on the larynx, the opening of the larynx, and the opening of the larynx itself is referred to as the glottis. Then it enters larynx. So larynx is, because of the vocal cords, larynx is simply referred to as the sound box, or it is also called as the voice box. Then it enters trachea, then it enters bronchi. You know that there are three bronchi: primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi. Then among bronchioles also you have initial bronchiole. The initial set of small tubes are called initial bronchiole. Then it enters into the final segments, the final branches, which are even thinner. They are called terminal bronchiole. And then finally it enters into respiratory bronchioles. So these are the three forms of bronchioles. These also you should remember. So in bronchi, you have primary, secondary, tertiary. Then the tertiary branches into initial bronchiole. Initial bronchiole branches into terminal bronchiole. Terminal bronchiole branches into respiratory bronchiole. Respiratory bronchiole receives ducts from alveoli. These ducts are called alveolar ducts. So they receive alveolar ducts from the alveoli. So where did we start now? We started from the nasal cavity. So all the way from the nasal cavity till the terminal bronchiole, including the terminal bronchiole. This classification is important. So starting from the nasal cavity till the terminal bronchiole, we call this entire segment of your respiratory system as conducting division, because it doesn't help in gaseous exchange. It only helps in passage of air. So whichever part of your respiratory system only helps in passage of air, that is called conducting division. Then you have the respiratory bronchiole. So you have the respiratory bronchiole, and then you have the alveolar duct, and lastly you have the alveoli. So these three parts together, we call them as the respiratory division. So anatomically, we can divide your respiratory system or your respiratory passageways. See, together all this is called bronchial tree because it branches like a branch of a tree. It has a branching pattern like that of a tree branch, and therefore it is called bronchial tree. In bronchial tree, starting from the nasal cavity onwards to the terminal bronchiole, it's called the conducting division because there is absolutely no exchange of gas. It is also good to know that these regions in your respiratory system where there is no exchange of gas, that region is also called dead space. In some books, you will come across this word. They call it as the anatomical or physiological dead space. Dead space means there is no gaseous exchange happening over there. That is called conducting division. Then you have respiratory bronchiole, alveolar duct, and alveoli. Major respiratory exchange happens in the alveoli. So the remaining parts, which are including the respiratory and the alveolar duct, is called as the respiratory division. Two major anatomical divisions in your respiratory system. And like I told you, through the nasopharynx, your nasal cavity opens into your throat, and through the glottis, your pharynx opens into the larynx. The mouth of the larynx, the opening of the larynx is referred to as the glottis. Another question they can ask you: till which tube in your lungs will you find C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings? They can ask you. See, I told you that the trachea has C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. I told you that there are 16 to 20 C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings lining the wall of the trachea. Till which bronchiole will you find the C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings? Very good. It is still the initial bronchioles. Beyond initial bronchiole, you will not find the C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. Another thing that is mentioned in the NCERT related to this, where exactly does the trachea branch into primary bronchus? It branches at the level of the fifth backbone of your upper back. We call the backbones present in your upper back as thoracic. Yes, it branches at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra. So all these facts which are mentioned in the NCERT, based on them, you may have certain questions which may appear in your competitive exams. C-shaped, I was just talking about this only, C-shaped cartilaginous rings. I've already told you that the C-shaped cartilaginous rings are actually made up of hyaline. Isn't it? Hyaline cartilaginous rings. And don't forget, the C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings are not present throughout your respiratory system. They start off in the trachea and up to the initial bronchiole. I told you initial bronchiole branches into terminal bronchiole, that branches into respiratory, that branches into alveolar duct, and finally alveolus. So up to, starting from the trachea, up to the initial bronchiole, you will have C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. Breathing rate in mammals is controlled by a part of the brain. So which part of the brain controls the breathing rate? Yes, it is your medulla oblongata. So I would like to tell you something more about this. So let me find a slide which has some more space in it. I'll come back to the sixth question. Okay. So we have some space here. Now they were talking about the breathing rate, and I told you that your breathing rate is regulated by a very important region in your medulla oblongata. So if this is your pons and if this is your medulla oblongata, this is a part of your hindbrain. Please remember, this bulge part is referred to as the pons, and this portion of your brain is referred to as the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, you will find two populations of neurons, one on the back and one in the front. Okay, now this one on the back is called the dorsal respiratory group. It's a population of neurons actually. So we abbreviate it as the DRG. And the one below, let me label it this side only. The one below is called the ventral respiratory group, or it is simply called the VRG. Collectively, these two is called respiratory rhythm center. So these two populations of neurons which are located in your medulla oblongata, one is called the dorsal respiratory group and one is called the ventral respiratory group. Together we call it as the respiratory rhythm, what did I call it? Center, sorry. Respiratory rhythm center we call it. And you know what? It is this dorsal group that actually is responsible mostly for inspiration. It has lot of inspiratory neurons over there. So we call them as eye neurons. It has lot of eye neurons. Actually, VRG is a mixture of eye and E neurons. But you know what? Mostly you will find expiratory neurons over here. So the VRG is mostly responsible for expiration. Okay, the dorsal respiratory group is responsible for inspiration and the ventral respiratory group is responsible for expiration. Although, like I just told you, ventral respiratory group is a mixture of both I and E neurons. However, E neurons are more predominant here, and that's why the function is expiration. These two together, they are called the respiratory rhythm center, which regulate your breathing rate. There is one more center in the front of the ventral respiratory group. I'm showing it in green over here and I'm shading it over here for you. This region, which is present in front of the ventral respiratory group, is called the chemosensitive area. We call it as the chemosensitive area. And you know what this chemosensitive area is sensitive to? It is sensitive to rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the rise in H plus ion concentration. So this region in the medulla oblongata is called the chemosensitive area. And where does it monitor this CO2 and H plus levels, children? The CO2 and the H plus levels are mostly monitored in the blood. Yes, there's blood everywhere. In the brain also there is blood, obviously. And of course, there's lymph everywhere. There's tissue fluid everywhere. And you know, in the brain, you also have another fluid. In the cavities of your brain, you have another fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. So that fluid also helps. I mean, in that fluid also, it monitors the carbon dioxide and the H plus level. So the role of oxygen is very less actually. Your body is mostly sensitive to carbon dioxide and H plus levels. Okay, so PCO2 level when it increases and H plus ion level when it increases, this chemosensitive area becomes very, very active. And you know what this chemosensitive area does? This chemosensitive area activates the dorsal respiratory group. I'm going to erase this later, this line with a plus mark, because I have to show you one more pathway. So please remember that this chemosensitive area, the moment it detects, oh, there's so much of carbon dioxide and H plus in the blood, it wants to tell your brain desperately to start breathing more. So it's going to send these positive signals to the dorsal respiratory group. The dorsal respiratory group will start firing now, and it will indicate, it will induce inspiration. When you inspire more, you're obviously going to expire more also. So you'll not only be taking more oxygen, but you'll also be throwing away a lot of carbon dioxide, and you'll bring down the acidity of the blood. The H plus level will come back to normal. So the chemosensitive area has a positive influence on the dorsal respiratory group. Okay, so let me erase this plus sign with an arrow here. I hope the idea is clear. Whenever there is very high PCO2 and very high H plus ion concentration in your blood or in your body fluids, it will activate the dorsal respiratory group to stimulate more and more inspiration so that you can take in more oxygen and you can eliminate the excess carbon dioxide that's being accumulated in your body tissues. So with this, we understood how this respiratory rhythm center works in uh, association with the chemosensitive area. Another very important area is located in the pons only. This area is called the pneumotaxic center. So they give only one sentence in the NCRT, but there's a lot of things you need to know behind this sentence. They say that the pneumotaxic center reduces the duration of inspiration. So how does it reduce the duration of inspiration? See, I'm labeling this pneumotaxic center. This pneumotaxic center is located in the pons. I'm omitting some details here which you don't have to know. So I'm directly telling you one important thing, that this pneumotaxic center has an inhibitory effect on your dorsal respiratory group. Why does it have an inhibitory? What will happen when it inhibits the dorsal respiratory group? And you know, it also has another pathway that moves on to the ventral respiratory group. It has an excitatory connection with the ventral respiratory group. Can you all think and tell me, if it sends a negative signal to DRG and a positive signal to VRG, what will you be doing? Will you be breathing in or will you breathe out? Can you let me know in the chat box? Very good. Yes, you will expire, isn't it? Because I just told you that the DRG is responsible for inspiration, but VRG is responsible for expiration. So what this pneumotaxic center is doing is, not only is it inhibiting, see here, not only is it inhibiting the dorsal respiratory group, but it is not only is it inhibiting the dorsal respiratory group, but it is also exciting, or it is also stimulating the ventral respiratory group. So you will stop inhaling and you will start exhaling. That's why in the textbook they have mentioned pneumotaxic center reduces the duration of inspiration. It is like a switch. You can think of this pneumotaxic center like a switch. It goes on and off. When it goes on, you will stop inhaling and you will start exhaling. So the switch for inhalation, exhalation is basically the pneumotaxic center. All right. So this is the main thing you should know. And the sentence is very clear. It reduces the duration of inspiration. and therefore it alters the respiratory rate, it alters your breathing rate. It is the one that is going to determine how many times you are going to breathe in a minute. Any guesses how many times you breathe in a minute, children? One of you tell me, how many times do you breathe in a minute? Darshan has not heard me properly. Yes, very good. So 12 to 16 times you breathe, isn't it? Yeah. So of course, in children, they breathe up to 30 times in a minute. Can you imagine? So it's more in young individuals, but as we grow older, we attain a stable respiratory rate of about 12 to 16 times. And that respiratory rate is actually determined by this pneumotaxic center. This pneumotaxic center puts an end to inhalation and puts us and begins exhalation. So you will stop inhaling and you will start exhaling. Then there's one more thing I want to tell you here. There's a nerve actually. This nerve also sends an inhibitory signal to the dorsal respiratory group, asking the dorsal respiratory group to actually stop firing. Again, if the dorsal respiratory group stops firing, then obviously you're going to stop inhaling and you're going to start exhaling. So this nerve is actually a vagus nerve. It is called vagus nerve. And you know where this nerve originates? This nerve originates from your alveolar stretch receptors. It originates from the alveolar stretch receptors. So from your alveoli, which are the sac-like structures present in your lungs, when they get inflated, see obviously when you're breathing in, what's going to happen to your alveoli? Your alveoli are expanding and they cannot keep expanding. And after a certain time, their expansion limit is reached. So when they have expanded to the maximum extent, when they have stretched to the maximum extent, this nerve will start firing signals. And these signals are delivered across this nerve to the dorsal respiratory group to inhibit the dorsal respiratory group. It's like you're telling your brain, your lungs are telling your brain that I'm full now. So it's time for you to stop inhaling and it's time for exhalation to start. So this is a very important reflex. It's called the Hering-Breuer's reflex. So remember this reflex which helps in regulating your breathing pattern. It's basically due to the stretch that is created in the wall of the alveoli when you have inhaled a lot of air. Okay. So it's like your lungs are saying, I cannot bloat up anymore. So you better stop inhaling and you better cut off your impulses to me so that I can just relax and I can throw away whatever air I have accumulated. So this is the job of the vagus nerve, which originates from the alveolar stretch receptors. Is this nerve sensory or motor? Any idea? See the direction of impulse transmission. Is it sensory or motor? Good, I asked this question because many of you are giving me wrong answers. Is it sensory or motor? The direction of the arrow you see, yes, it is sensory, it's afferent, it's carrying signals towards your central nervous system, towards your brain. It's not motor, children. Yes, some of you have told me it's motor. Please, it's not motor. Motor neurons always carry impulses away from the central nervous system. This nerve is carrying signals towards the central nervous system. Which is the stimulus for this nerve? Stretch is the stimulus. When your alveoli undergo stretch, that stretch in the wall of the alveolus is going to act like a stimulus. Okay. Another thing I would like to accommodate here, let me erase these parts. You know that one is dorsal respiratory group and one is ventral respiratory group. There are two more signals which can actually excite. See, this one is inhibiting the dorsal respiratory group. The black nerve that I have shown is something which inhibits the dorsal respiratory group. Now I will show you two more nerves in red I will show you, which end on your dorsal respiratory group, but they have a stimulating effect on the dorsal respiratory group. So one of the nerves originates from receptors in your systemic aorta. They are called aortic receptors. And one of them originates from a group of receptors in your carotid artery. It is called carotid sinus. Sorry, carotid body it is called. This carotid body is present in your carotid artery. It's an artery that runs in your neck region. So from your carotid body, which is associated with the carotid artery which runs in your neck region, and the receptors present in your systemic aorta, the aortic receptors, you have signals which reach the dorsal respiratory group, which excite or stimulate the dorsal respiratory group. I've put a plus sign over there. The nerve that carries the signals from the aortic receptor is again the vagus nerve. It's a branch of the same vagus nerve which is involved in the Hering-Breuer's reflex. Whereas this branch, which is coming out of the carotid body, which is a structure associated with the carotid artery in your neck region, is a nerve that is a branch of your glossopharyngeal nerve. We call it as the glossopharyngeal, which happens to be the cranial nerve 9. So all these are sending their signals up into the dorsal respiratory group. They are not sending negative signals, they are exciting the dorsal respiratory group. Together we can call these aortic receptors and the receptors present in the carotid body as peripheral chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors. And you know what they are sensitive to? Both the aortic receptors as well as the carotid body receptors are sensitive to increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide and increase in H plus ion. So whenever they detect a high PCO2 level and a high level of H plus ion, they are sending alarm signals to the dorsal respiratory group. They are asking the dorsal respiratory group to start firing. See, plus sign I'm showing here. They will excite the neurons of the dorsal respiratory group. They're telling the dorsal respiratory group that we have detected very high CO2 and very high H plus in the blood. So it is your job to initiate, to bring forth greater inspiration. If you initiate greater inspiration, then a person will breathe more and the person can eliminate this unwanted excess partial pressure of carbon dioxide and H plus ion concentration. Okay, so I hope you got an idea here that two types of chemosensitive regions are there. One is a part of the brain itself. We simply call it as the chemosensitive area. There is another chemosensitive region which is a part of your blood circulatory system. That's why it's called peripheral. It's away from the brain. And those peripheral chemoreceptors, one of them is located in your aortic wall and one of them is located in your carotid artery, which runs in your neck region. Both of them are constantly monitoring levels of carbon dioxide and H plus in the blood. The moment they detect very high levels of carbon dioxide and H plus in your blood, they start sending alarm signals to your DRG. They send positive signals. That means they are not inhibitory, they are excitatory. So they send excitatory signals to the dorsal respiratory group, and the dorsal respiratory group will now start firing impulses so that you will inspire more and you will exhale more associated with inspiration, obviously, and you will throw away excess carbon dioxide and H plus. So this is the major part of this chapter, children. A lot of important points to remember associated with the regulation of respiration. Okay, so I hope it is clear. Before I erase, if there's any doubt that you have, take a screenshot of it so that you can, in the textbook, all one words have been mentioned. They have just mentioned one statement about peripheral chemoreceptors, but now you know that peripheral chemoreceptors originate from two receptors in your body, aortic receptors in your systemic aorta and carotid body in your carotid artery running in your neck region. And then your alveolar stretch receptors. You can't keep stretching your lungs. There should be a limit to it. You can't keep inhaling. There should come a time where you will stop inhaling and start exhaling. So that is the job of stretch receptors. Stretch receptors are the ones which terminate on dorsal respiratory group by sending inhibitory signals. Pneumotaxic center is the switch. If the switch is on, then your inhalation will stop and exhalation will start. So it reduces the duration of inhalation and it regulates your breathing rate or your respiratory rhythm. Okay, fine. So let us move on to the next question. I'm going to clear this slide now. The question 6 asks us about your inhalation and exhalation. Which of the following statements is correct? Inspiration is an active process, inspiration is passive, expiration is active. Both are passive processes. The correct answer here is inspiration is an active process. Why is inspiration an active process? Because it involves muscle contraction. Whichever process involves muscle contraction, all of you please remember muscle contraction consumes energy. It consumes energy in the form of ATP. Which are the muscles that contract during inhalation? You have your muscles present between your ribs. It is called the external intercostal muscles. The muscles that run between your ribs are called the external intercostal muscles. And of course, the muscle present below your lung is your diaphragm muscles. Both your diaphragm muscle and your external intercostal muscles must undergo contraction. For example, if this is your sternum or breastbone and these are your ribs, so you know that your ribs are attached to your sternum like this. So where do you find these external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles? See the orientation here. The orientation of the external and internal intercostal muscles are different. The external intercostal muscles are oriented at this angle. What I'm showing in blue is the external intercostal muscles. These are the ones which actually help in inhalation. Okay, and then you have the internal intercostal muscles. I will change the color for the internal intercostal muscles. See the orientation of internal intercostal muscles, it is different. So the green muscles that you see are responsible for exhalation, and the blue muscles that you're seeing between your ribs are responsible for inhalation. So let me label the blue ones here as the external intercostal muscles. So these are the ones which help in inhalation. For E, it is I. You can remember something like that. Okay, for external intercostal muscles are meant for inhalation, and these muscles which are oriented at a different plane are referred to as the internal intercostal muscles. And the internal intercostal muscles for I, it is E. So it is not inspiration, it is involved in exhalation. Actually, not regular exhalation. To be very strict, to speak very strictly, it is your forced exhalation. If I ask you to exhale forcibly, then your internal intercostal muscle, because normal exhalation is a passive process. It doesn't require any muscle contraction. Just that when your muscles relax, when the rib muscles relax, that's when you have your normal exhalation that happens. When do you have to spend a lot of energy is if I ask you to breathe very, very forcibly. Put all your might and breathe out. Then only for forced expiration, you will be needing this internal intercostal muscles. Okay, so because there is contraction of the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm muscles, you all should learn the mechanism of breathing also. Whenever there is contraction of external intercostal muscles, the ribs move upwards and outwards. So you can feel the upward movement of your chest. If you place your palm on your chest when you're breathing in, your chest is moving up. That's because your ribs are moving upwards and outwards, and that is due to the contraction of the external intercostal muscles. And you know what happens to the diaphragm? The diaphragm becomes flat. So when your diaphragm becomes flat and when your ribs move upwards and outwards, the volume in your lung will increase and the pressure in your lung will fall. What do you call the pressure in your lungs? It is called intrapulmonary pressure. Obviously, the chamber, the chest cavity will have more volume in it. So lung is very free now. It has a lot of space around it. So the pressure in your lung will be less compared to your atmospheric pressure. That's why air will gush into your lungs. So all this is only to bring down the intrapulmonary pressure. To bring down the intrapulmonary pressure, your ribs have to move upwards and outwards. For that to happen, the external intercostal muscle should contract. Okay, like I told you, see how it is disposed. The external intercostal muscles are actually on the outside of the ribs, on the lateral side of the ribs. That's why they are called external intercostal muscles. And you can see how obliquely they are oriented. And then your diaphragm becomes flat due to contraction. When all this happens, the cavity in your chest will become more voluminous. And that volume, increase in volume, will bring down the pressure in your lungs. The lung is not getting squeezed from all sides. The lung is able to breathe now. It's free inside your chest cavity. How much does the pressure in your lung fall? It falls below the atmospheric pressure. So atmospheric pressure is high and the pressure inside your lung is low. And as a result, what's going to happen? Air always flows from high pressure to low pressure. So air gushes into the lungs. Okay. The reverse happens during exhalation. So I want you to go through the exhalation process. It is just the opposite. The external intercostal muscle will relax, the diaphragm will relax, the ribs or the chest will move inwards and downwards, the diaphragm will move up, it will become dome shaped. So literally your lung is getting squeezed from all the sides, so the volume will decrease and the pressure will increase. And when pressure increases beyond the atmospheric pressure, whatever air is there in your lung will be pushed out of your system. So it will be thrown out. It will be ejected out of your lungs. That is called exhalation. So it all boils down to changes happening in the intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure within your lung. All right. I was telling you about the breathing rate of a normal human. It is about 12 to 16 times a minute, and the breathing rate of a child is much, much higher. So it is more than that of the adult. I told you it can be up to about 30 times a minute. Because in a child the metabolic rate is very, very high. It's still growing. The cells in the body are very, very active. They're consuming a lot of energy in all the growth zones in the body. A lot of cells are being put out. That's why the metabolic rate is very high. The body is demanding for more oxygen, and as a result the breathing rate is more than that of the adult. During oxygen transport, the oxyhemoglobin at the tissue level liberates oxygen to the cells because. So here you should understand the love-hate relationship between oxygen and hemoglobin. One molecule of hemoglobin can successfully combine with 4 molecules of oxygen. See this reaction? This is the forward reaction. This is the reverse backward reaction. It's a reversible process. So what I'll do here is I will use another color for the backward reaction. So hemoglobin, 1 molecule of hemoglobin combines with 4 molecules of oxygen, and they share a love-hate relationship in order to form HbO2 4 times oxyhemoglobin. HbO2 4 times. Where is the love and where is the hate over here? Obviously, when they combine together, they share a love relationship, and obviously, when they break apart from each other, they hate each other. And you should remember, where do they fall in love with each other? They fall in love with each other at the lungs. And where do they fall in hate with each other? At the tissues. So at the lungs, hemoglobin and oxygen are very attracted to each other. They combine together and they form oxyhemoglobin. At the tissues, they hate each other. So hemoglobin and oxygen, which have combined to form oxyhemoglobin, will dissociate into hemoglobin and oxygen. They're asking in the question, what is it at the tissue level that is responsible for this hate? Can you answer the question? What breeds this hate in the tissue level, which makes hemoglobin and oxygen hate each other, so that hemoglobin gives away the oxygen so that oxygen can go to the tissues? Very good. It is last option, isn't it? At your tissues, partial pressure of oxygen is very low and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very high. Your tissues are using up all the oxygen and liberating carbon dioxide. So obviously the carbon dioxide tension will be very high in the tissues and the oxygen tension will be very low in the tissues. This is the thing that is responsible for the hate that breeds between hemoglobin and oxygen. This is not the only thing, okay? There are a lot of other factors also. See, I'm going to write it here. At the tissues, there is very high PCO2, there is very low PO2, there is high temperature, and there is high H plus ion concentration. That means the conditions are acidic or alkaline. If H plus ion concentration is very high, the conditions are acidic. At the lungs, what makes them fall in love with each other? At the lungs, PCO2 is very low and PO2 level is high, very high actually, 104 millimeter mercury is the level of PO2 in your lungs. Temperature is low comparatively because your lung is constantly ventilated by atmospheric air. So obviously the temperature will be low. And also the H plus ion concentration will be low. If H plus ion concentration is low, is it acidity or is it alkaline? It's alkaline. Very good. So remember this love-hate relationship, children. This is, and how much of oxygen gets transported this way? 97% of oxygen. 97% of oxygen is transported in your bloodstream through this mechanism, which is in combination with hemoglobin. All right? Yes, 3% by plasma in dissolved state. Okay? Okay. Which of the following changes occur if you were to move to a higher altitude from a plane? Imagine you're living in a plane in a plateau region, and if you move to a higher altitude, what possible changes can happen in your system? See, the thing here is when you move to higher altitude, you're moving to lower pressure, lower atmospheric pressure. So the atmospheric air becomes thinner and there's less oxygen entering into your blood. So to compensate for that, or to make most of whatever little oxygen is available as air gets thinner, yes. So you will increase your red blood cell production and there will be an increased breathing rate. Okay, two things happen when you move from plane to higher altitude. That is to compensate for the thinned down air, your body will start, your bone marrow will start making more RBCs. So there is increase in the RBC, that is red blood cell production, and there is increased breathing rate because you're not breathing in, even if you breathe in normally, you're not taking in enough oxygen because the pressure outside is low. It's not as high as the pressure that exists in the planes. Okay. Yes, this is something that is called acclimatization. Actually, you get acclimatized to higher altitudes once you have moved over to that particular region. So this is very simple. The diagram shows a few parts over here. The part D is nothing but larynx or voice box. A is the trachea, that is your windpipe. B is the primary bronchus. Remember that it's the primary bronchus that penetrates into your lungs. See, there are two primary bronchi, one on the either side, and this bifurcation I already told you happens at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra, and then you have the smallest of tubes which are referred to as the bronchioles. Initial bronchiole, terminal bronchiole, respiratory bronchiole. Up to the initial bronchiole you would find the C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. Whether a child died after normal birth or died even before birth means the child has died in the mother's womb itself. It's called stillbirth. How would you find out, children? Oh, the key is already given. So how would you find out? Why is it? What has it got to do with residual capacity, children? So that is residual volume of air. See, residual volume of air is a certain amount of air that is always trapped in the lungs. You cannot get rid of it. Even if you breathe out as much forcibly as possible, the residual air will always remain in your lung. The fact that residual air is there in the lung, that means the baby must have taken birth and it must have taken air into its lungs. So if you find residual air in the lungs of the baby, that means the baby took birth and then passed away. But if there is no air at all in the lungs, there is no residual air in the lungs, that means it never saw the daylight, isn't it? It never could breathe oxygen. Because when the baby is still in the mother's womb, the placenta caters to all the oxygen demand. It doesn't use its lungs at all. So if you find residual air in the lungs, you can be sure that the baby has died after taking birth. If there is no residual air, that means the baby has died within the mother's womb itself because it never got a chance to take in air. And obviously, that's the reason why you don't see any residual air in the lungs. What is dead space air? I told you, no, what is dead space? Does anyone remember? Anatomical or physiological dead space means what? Yes, whichever part of your respiratory system where absolutely no gaseous exchange takes place. The conducting division, yes, the conducting part of your respiratory tract. Whatever air passes through the conducting division where there is no gaseous exchange at all, that air is called the dead space air. And those sites in your respiratory system where there is no gaseous exchange, where there is no respiratory exchange, they are called, that is called anatomical or physiological dead space. Okay. Which of the following factors raise the P50 value? P50 means the value of hemoglobin, the value of partial pressure of oxygen, where the saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is 50%. So let me find a vacant slide here so that I can explain this also. This is another very routinely asked question, children, about oxygen dissociation curve. So what do you do if you want to plot an oxygen dissociation curve? So in the oxygen dissociation curve on the y-axis, you are going to take percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, and on the y-axis you are going to take partial pressure of oxygen. The curve that we get when we plot the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen against partial pressure of oxygen is referred to as the oxygen dissociation curve. So let us say 100% saturation. We have taken the grades up to 100, and here also partial pressure of oxygen 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100. And now if you see the curve that you will get, the oxygen dissociation curve that we will get now, it will be sigmoid in nature, see. So this will be the oxygen dissociation curve. And what do you understand from this oxygen dissociation curve? First of all, understand what is percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Percentage saturation means, for example, if I say the percentage saturation is 100%, 100% if I say, that means all the hemoglobin molecules in the blood have become bound to oxygen. There is no free hemoglobin molecule. Every single hemoglobin molecule present in your blood has become attached to, has become bound to oxygen. That is called 100% saturation. What is P50? P50 means 50% saturation. What do you mean by 50% saturation? 50% of the hemoglobin molecules are attached to oxygen. The other 50% of the hemoglobin molecules have decided to give away the oxygen. They have become dissociated from oxygen. So 50% oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, 50% oxygen is given away to the tissues. So this is what saturation means. 100% saturation means all the hemoglobin molecules have oxygen bound to them. 50% saturation means 50% of them have oxygen attached to them, 50% have decided to give away the oxygen. So with this in mind, when we talk about the oxygen dissociation curve under standard conditions, this curve that I have plotted here right now is under standard condition. Standard condition means, you know what, now you're all sitting down, no? Sitting, sleeping, snoring, whatever you're doing, you're not doing any exercise, isn't it? Your body is not doing any kind of exercise. So this graph that I have plotted now, the partial pressure of oxygen with the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen, is applicable to the current state, resting state. You are not doing any exercise, you are resting. Okay, so let me take 2 points on the x-axis. Let me take a partial pressure of 100. Where can you expect a partial pressure of 100 millimeter mercury? PO2 is equal to 100 millimeter mercury. You can expect this at your lungs. Now let me take a partial pressure of 40. Where can you expect a partial pressure of oxygen is equal to 40 millimeter mercury? Tell me quickly. Where do you think oxygen levels are low? 40 millimeter mercury. Yes, it is at your tissues. So I have selected 2 points on the x-axis. One is 100. Actually, actually in your lungs, it's not 100, it's 104, very strictly speaking. But 100 is a very high partial pressure of oxygen, and that high partial pressure of oxygen is present at your alveoli. A partial pressure of 40, a partial pressure of oxygen which is equal to 40 is something which exists at your tissue, resting tissues, at resting state, not your tissue that is exercising. At resting state it is at your tissue. Now how do I know what is the saturation level? You know what I should do now? I should extend a vertical line all the way from this 100 millimeter mercury to the graph, and I must extend a vertical line to the x-axis. See, I'm getting a saturation of 100%. Same thing I will do for the tissue now. I will extend this partial pressure of 40 to the curve, and I will extend a horizontal line. Say for example, I am getting a percentage saturation of 70%. So what is this telling you? It is telling you that at your lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is so high. That is why all the hemoglobin molecules have become bound to oxygen. That is why the saturation is 100%. None of the hemoglobin molecules are free. Every hemoglobin molecule is in love with oxygen. So much of love in the lungs. Why? Because of the higher partial pressure of oxygen. So now you know that partial pressure of oxygen has a direct effect on saturation. Higher the partial pressure of oxygen, higher is the saturation. All hemoglobin molecules are in love with oxygen, 100% saturation. Now all of you tell me, in your tissues, is the saturation increasing or decreasing? We went down to 40 millimeter mercury. At 40 millimeter mercury, the saturation is falling down. From 100%, only 70% are in love with oxygen. What happened to the remaining 30% hemoglobin? The remaining 30% hemoglobin, they had a fight and they broke up with the oxygen. Where did that 30% go? Where did that remaining 30%? Just give me a minute, children. I'm getting an important call. Okay. So at the lungs, at partial pressure of oxygen of 100 millimeter mercury, 100% of hemoglobin were in love with oxygen. As a tissue, at partial pressure of oxygen being 40 millimeter mercury, only 70% of the hemoglobin molecules are in love with oxygen. Answer my question, is this good or bad? Is this a normal thing, or is it something which is good for your system, or is it bad for your system? Okay. So like, I think many of you have given me the right answer. This is good. This is normal. This fall in saturation is very, very much required by the tissue. Because imagine if even in the tissues, if all the 100% of the hemoglobin molecules are still in love with oxygen, they will never let go of oxygen. If they never let go of oxygen, who is going to suffer? The tissue is going to suffer. The tissue needs oxygen desperately here. So this is a good thing. From 100% being in love with oxygen, 70% are in love with oxygen. The 30% of the hemoglobin molecules that broke up with oxygen, that 30% of the oxygen, see the difference here, it is 30%. This 30% oxygen that is coming off, that is breaking away from hemoglobin, is delivered to the tissues. So this is a normal thing. This is what you can read from the oxygen dissociation curve. Why is hemoglobin and oxygen dissociating from each other at the tissue? Because of a low partial pressure of oxygen, which is PO2 equal to 40 millimeter mercury. At low partial pressure of oxygen, about 30% of the hemoglobin oxygen couple, they break up and oxygen goes to the tissues. This breaking up, this dissociation is good for us because hemoglobin at some point has to say goodbye to oxygen so that oxygen can go to the tissue and serve its purpose. Otherwise, hemoglobin, if all 100% are clinging on to oxygen, there will be no oxygen for the tissues. Hemoglobin can never forever be in love with oxygen at the tissues because of a fall in partial pressure of oxygen to 40 millimeter mercury. They have to break up, they have to say goodbye to each other. Now coming to the very important aspect. Sometimes this curve can shift to the right side. Let me draw another curve here and let me erase some parts over here. So you know that 30%, 70% saturation is understood from the y-axis. 100% saturation is understood again from the y-axis. And the difference is delivered to the tissue. 100 minus 70, 30. 30% oxygen is being delivered to the tissue. That also you understood. And I told you what is saturation. Think of saturation as hemoglobin in love with oxygen. 100% love with oxygen, 70% love with oxygen, remaining 30% have broken apart. That 30% is delivered to the tissue. Now what happens is, I think I will use green or probably red only. Now see, the curve is shifting to its right. Under certain circumstances, the oxygen dissociation curve will shift like this to the right. So I have drawn a new curve over here, that is the red curve, and it has shifted to the right. And this shifting of the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve to the right side is called the Bohr's shift, or it is called the Bohr's effect. You may ask why it is shifting like this. It is shifting like this because of conditions during exercise. During exercise, or say you're doing some mild to strenuous exercise, Your partial pressure of oxygen at the tissues. The conditions here also, we are talking about tissues only. There is very high partial pressure of carbon dioxide than normal, because now you are not sitting quietly, you are exercising. And there is low partial pressure of oxygen. We know anyway it is 40. There is also very high temperature, and there is also very high H plus ion concentration. And when your muscles, when you are exercising due to increased metabolism, there is also a compound which increases in your blood. It is called bisphosphoglycerate, bisphosphoglyceric acid. So sometimes when this bisphosphoglyceric acid increases in its concentration, that is also going to shift the curve to the right side. All this is associated with influence of partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Generally, a rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And why is there a rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Because your muscles are not at rest. You're either involved in some kind of a mild exercise, or you're involved in some kind of a strenuous exercise, that there is a lot of carbon dioxide getting pulled up in your muscles, in your body tissues. This shift is called Bohr's effect. What is the consequence of this shift? The same partial pressure of 40, see now, because of this shift, I'm going to put a dot here on the curve and see the saturation, how much it has come down. Say it has come down to, say, I will just consider it as 50%. Earlier, the saturation when you were at rest was 70%. Now the saturation has come down even more. Again, tell me, is it good or bad? What is it suggesting? This fall in saturation is suggesting that, answer my question, listen carefully. When you are exercising, when you are not exercising, at your tissue, 70% of hemoglobin were in love with oxygen. But now when you are exercising at your tissue, 50% are in love with oxygen. 50% of them have fallen apart from oxygen. This is good. What does it indicate? Does it indicate less oxygen is getting delivered to your tissue, or more oxygen is getting delivered to your tissue? Answer my question. What does it indicate? Yes, it indicates that more oxygen is getting delivered. When you were not exercising, only 30% of oxygen was delivered, because 70% were in love with oxygen. But now when you're exercising, 50% is getting delivered to your tissue, because only 50% are in love with oxygen. So this indicates that when you are exercising, the dissociation, the saturation value even more falls down because of the shift to the right. Because the curve, the sigmoid curve is shifting to the right, there is a further fall in the saturation value. That means more oxygen is getting delivered to your body tissues. When you were not exercising, 30% was delivered to your body tissue, because 70% is the saturation value. Now when you are exercising, 50% is the saturation value. That means 50% are bound to oxygen. They are in love with oxygen. The other 50% decided to throw away oxygen. So you are getting 50% oxygen to your body tissue. So this shift to the right is referred to as the Bohr's effect, or the Bohr shift. So two things about oxygen dissociation curve. One is the standard oxygen dissociation curve, when there is not much of an interference from a rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, probably because you are in a resting condition. The second one is when the curve shifts to the right because you are indulging in some kind of a physical exertion, and that is what is bringing into picture a greater level of partial pressure of carbon dioxide, rise in temperature, rise in a chemical called bisphosphoglyceric acid, rise in H plus ion, and that will shift the curve to the right. Shifting to the right is a good thing, because by not shifting to the right, you could deliver only 30% of oxygen to the tissue. But now by shifting to the right, you are able to deliver 50% oxygen to the tissues. Your delivery is becoming more efficient when the curve is shifting to the right. Without shifting, saturation came down to 70%. 70% are in love with oxygen, 30% gave away. So you could give away only 30%. But now with the shifting, only 50% are in love with oxygen. You could give away 50%. The other 50% decided to give away the oxygen to the body tissues. So I want all of you to read this 100% thoroughly from your NCRT. Now I answer my question. They are saying it is shifting. The hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve is shifting to the right, they are saying. So which are the factors responsible for the Bohr's shift? Answer this question now. This is the Bohr's shift. Yes, very good, Nashra. It is 1 and 3, isn't it? Rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide and rise in H plus ion concentration. Fall in temperature is not possible because I already told you that in your tissues there is a rise in temperature. And also there is a rise in bisphosphoglycerate or diphosphoglyceric acid. Sometimes it's also called diphosphoglyceric acid. That also rises due to metabolic rate. It doesn't fall. So first and 3 are the ones that contribute to increase in oxygen delivery or decrease in saturation. Do not get confused. Saturation means how many are bound to oxygen, how many are in love with oxygen. And the remaining percentage is given to the tissue. If 70% are in love with oxygen, 30% went to the tissue. If 50% are in love with oxygen, the other 50% out of 100 went to the tissue. So the lesser the saturation, the better it is at the tissue, because that means your hemoglobin is more efficient in dissociating with oxygen and delivering that oxygen to your body tissues. Okay. An important function of the fluid in the pleural cavity is to obviously to reduce friction between the visceral and the parietal pleura, isn't it? The inner layer of the pleural membrane, see actually your pleural membranes are 2 in number. The inner layer is called visceral and the outer layer is called as the parietal. So inner pleura is the visceral pleura and the outer pleura is the parietal pleura. So imagine if there was no fluid between them, then these two layers would have rubbed against each other, isn't it? So to prevent that kind of damage due to friction, you have this pleural fluid. Bohr effect is, can you answer the question, children? Bohr effect is the effect of. Yes, Darshan, think about it. I told you something breaks apart because of something at the tissues. More breaking away happens from 70%, the saturation becomes 50%, they start breaking away more. That is because the effect of carbon dioxide on oxyhemoglobin. Because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high at the tissues, because the PCO2 is high at the tissues, oxyhemoglobin will no longer stay together. They will break apart, they will dissociate from each other, and only when they dissociate, the percentage saturation comes down. Okay? Blood analysis of a patient reveals an unusually high quantity of carboxyhemoglobin. Very simple. The person has inhaled carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide binds irreversibly to hemoglobin molecule. It is dangerous carbon monoxide poisoning. And carbon monoxide also has so much more affinity towards hemoglobin than any other respiratory gas like oxygen and carbon dioxide. And when carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, like I told you, it is an irreversible binding and it results in the formation of a complex called carboxyhemoglobin. Yes, very good. 200 times it has a higher affinity. Which of the following amino acid acts as a blood buffer in hemoglobin? What do you mean by buffer? Buffer is where it can resist changes in pH. The amino acid that acts as a blood buffer is histidine amino acid. What is this blood buffer? Why should hemoglobin act as a blood buffer? See, what happens in your tissues is, I will tell you a quick summary of what is happening at your tissues. So in your tissues, you have lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide levels are very high. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very high. And you know what happens? This carbon dioxide enters your blood, and it enters your blood plasma, and it goes all the way inside your RBC. See, this is your RBC. So carbon dioxide actually diffuses into your RBC. And once it diffuses into your RBC, this carbon dioxide combines with water to form an acid called carbonic acid, which will immediately split into bicarbonate, that is HCO3 minus. I'll write H plus over here, H plus and HCO3 minus. Now what happens is this H plus is dangerous for us, because if H plus keeps accumulating, it will increase the acidity of the cytoplasm of the RBC. This is where hemoglobin comes into picture. Hemoglobin, which is in the form of HbO2, there is no space here. Okay, let me draw it again. So this carbon dioxide enters into your RBC. So this is your RBC. This is happening in your tissue, okay? So carbon dioxide combines with water to form H2CO3. That will immediately split into H plus and HCO3 minus. Actually, HCO3 minus will not be kept inside your RBC. It will be thrown out in exchange for chloride ion. This is called chloride shift. All of you remember this. HCO3 minus that is formed inside your RBC due to carbon dioxide transport is not retained inside the cytoplasm of the RBC. For every ion of HCO3 minus that is entering into the plasma, see, it is pumped into the plasma. For every ion of HCO3 minus that is pumped into the plasma, a chloride ion is received into the cytoplasm. Yes, it's called the Hamburger's phenomenon or the chloride shift. HCO3 is going out and chloride is coming in. So this is taken care of. The problem is with this H plus ion. So what this H plus ion goes and does is, there is oxyhemoglobin in your RBC, because this is a blood that has come from your lungs. Remember, the blood coming to your tissue is what kind of blood? The blood that comes to your tissue, is it oxygenated or deoxygenated blood? It is oxygenated blood. So it's coming from your lungs. So this blood already has HbO2 in it, oxyhemoglobin in it. Now what happens is this H plus goes and binds to this hemoglobin, will give away this oxygen now. It will become free hemoglobin molecule, and the 4 molecules of oxygen is given to the tissue, because the tissue is dying for oxygen now. Now what happens to this hemoglobin is, this hemoglobin will act as a buffer. It knows that this H plus ion is something which is very dangerous. So this hemoglobin and H plus ion will now combine together to form a molecule called hydroxyhemoglobin, HHB. So what has hemoglobin done here? Hemoglobin has acted as a buffer. The moment it sees H plus ion, it captures that H plus ion, because it knows if H plus ion is let free as it is, it will alter the pH. It will make the cytoplasm of the RBC very, very acidic. That's why we call hemoglobin as a buffer. It gives away its oxygen, because you know what, actually H plus ion also can bring about certain changes in the hemoglobin structure. That's why it's giving away oxygen. So it's all interrelated. Why did hemoglobin give away oxygen? Because of this H plus ion. And when it gives away oxygen for a very short period of time, it is free hemoglobin, and this will immediately capture this H plus ion. It reacts with this amino acid, histidine on hemoglobin protein, and they will form a complex called hydroxyhemoglobin or HHP. So in doing so, what is hemoglobin doing? Hemoglobin has successfully counteracted any kind of change that could have happened in the pH of the RBC cytoplasm. So it resists the changes in the pH. That's why we call hemoglobin as a blood buffer. This is happening this is operational at the tissues. At the tissues, because of H plus ion only, hemoglobin is saying goodbye to oxygen, and hemoglobin is going and binding to H plus, because hemoglobin does not want to let H plus as it is, because it knows that H plus can wreak havoc. It can change the pH of the RBC cytoplasm. And where exactly does H plus go and bind in hemoglobin? H plus actually interacts with a specific amino acid residue in the globin chain of hemoglobin. That specific amino acid residue is histidine. Okay. What is true about RBC in humans? They carry about 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide. They transport 99.5% of carbon dioxide, 80% of oxygen, and 20% is transported in dissolved state. Among these three, which one do you think is the correct statement? A is the correct statement, isn't it? Actually, they don't transport. The first statement says the correct one. 20 to 25%, to be very precise, 23% is actually transported of carbon dioxide is actually transported by your RBC in combination with hemoglobin. And they don't transport 80%, they transport 97% of oxygen in combination with hemoglobin, and the remaining 3% is transported in the form of dissolved state in the plasma. They do not carry carbon dioxide at all is also wrong, because carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form a complex called not carboxyhemoglobin. Carboxyhemoglobin was with respect to carbon monoxide. With respect to carbon dioxide, it is called carbaminohemoglobin. The complex that is formed by carbon dioxide and hemoglobin is carbaminohemoglobin. Okay? How many heme molecules are present? Very simple. How many heme molecules are present in one molecule of hemoglobin? Read the question properly before answering. Directly, many of you are saying 4, 4, 4, 4. It's 1, isn't it? Sorry, I am sorry. I made a mistake. Yes, it's 1. It's not 4. How many heme molecules are present in one molecule of hemoglobin? I'm sorry. I also read the question wrongly. It is 4 only. 4 heme and 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, so yes, you were right. There are totally 4 heme and 4 globin chains in hemoglobin molecule, and each heme molecule attaches itself to one molecule of oxygen. That is the reason we have one molecule of hemoglobin being able to combine with 4 molecules of oxygen. Very correct. Many of you were correct. I'm sorry. Another thing is, how much of hemoglobin is there in your blood? They may ask you. 12 to 16 gram of hemoglobin. Let us take on an approximation 15 gram of hemoglobin in 100 ml of blood. These values are important. 100 ml of your blood will have 12 to 16 or about 15 gram of hemoglobin in them. And 1 gram of hemoglobin, 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry how much of oxygen, children? 1.34 ml of oxygen. These values are also important. Then can you tell me how much can 100 ml of blood carry? 100 ml of blood can have how much oxygen, children? Yes, very good. 20 ml, isn't it? 100 ml will have 15 gram of hemoglobin. 15 into 1.34 will give us approximately 20 ml of oxygen. So remember that 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 ml of oxygen, And in 100 ml of blood, there is up to about 15 gram of hemoglobin, 12 to 16 gram of hemoglobin in 100 ml of blood. That means in 100 ml of blood, with 15 gram of hemoglobin, 15 into 1.34 ml of oxygen, 20 ml can be carried. In resting state, how much oxygen is delivered to your tissue? Out of 20 ml, when you are resting, only 5 ml is delivered to, only 5 ml of oxygen is delivered to the tissues. Please remember this. Out of 20 ml, only 5 ml is delivered to the tissues. Because if you remember the oxygen dissociation curve, when you are not exercising, out of 100% saturation, 70% the saturation comes down to. 30% of it is delivered to the tissues. So 30% of 20 ml is approximately 5 ml. So out of 20 ml of oxygen carried by 100 ml of blood, oxygenated blood that reaches your tissue, not all the 20 ml of oxygen is delivered to your tissue. Only 5 ml of it is delivered successfully to your tissue. That is again because of oxygen dissociation curve. At the tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen is less. It is 40 millimeter mercury. And when you see the sigmoid oxygen dissociation curve, you will see that the saturation falls down from 100% to 70%. If 70% is the saturation, the remaining 30% has gone away to the tissue. 30% out of 20 ml is approximately 5 ml. Okay. A large proportion of oxygen is left unused in the human blood even after its uptake by body tissues. This oxygen, so you know what happens? This actually happens in the muscles. In your muscle, you also have another respiratory pigment which is involved in delivering oxygen to your muscles. Do you know which is that respiratory pigment which is involved in your uh, which is involved in picking up oxygen from your hemoglobin and delivering it to the muscles? It is called the myoglobin. So that unused oxygen that your tissues did not use is stored up in this myoglobin so that it can act as a reserve during muscular exercise. So please remember, not all oxygen gets delivered, but especially in your muscles, some amount of oxygen can be transferred onto myoglobin and it can be stored in your muscle without it getting used up by your muscle, so that in case you are involved in some activity in the future, it can act as a reserve during exercise. So the correct answer is it acts as a reserve during muscular exercise. Hiccups can best be described as, what do you think causes hiccups, children? Actually, you know, hiccups is because of diaphragm. It is the twitching of your diaphragm muscles. And when you hiccup, what are you going to do? You are actually taking partial inhalation you're carrying out. So it is called jerky incomplete inspiration. You don't breathe in entirely. You take in bouts of air in bits, isn't it? So hiccups can best be described as jerky incomplete inspiration. A fast running man has a fast heartbeat, a slow pulse, a shallow breathing. In such conditions, he has a heart, his heartbeat is very fast, but his pulse is slow. That means the blood is not passing very efficiently through his blood vessels, and his breathing is very slow. So something is wrong with his health then. So what do you think is the problem here? After fast running, a man has fast heartbeat, slow pulse, and shallow breathing. In such conditions, he has. First of all, you need to know here, why is his breathing not deep? Why is his breathing shallow? I had told you in the respiratory rhythm center. most of the components of your respiratory rhythm center are sensitive to, can you tell me, are they sensitive to oxygen or sensitive to carbon dioxide and H plus ions? Chemosensory area, peripheral chemoreceptors, yes, they're sensitive to carbon dioxide. Here the person is made to breathe, his nervous system is telling him to breathe slowly. Shallow breathing, probably because there is less carbon dioxide in his blood. So immediately after running, maybe he breathed in lot of air and now his breathing has become shallow because his respiratory rhythm center, the chemoreceptors have sent signal to the respiratory rhythm center saying that there is less carbon dioxide. So anyway, it's okay. You don't have to make the person breathe more. And that's why he's breathing very shallow. So please remember, your chemosensory areas, your peripheral chemoreceptors, all of it are very, very sensitive to carbon dioxide and H plus levels in your blood. So he is breathing shallow because of less carbon. Otherwise, his chemosensory receptors will get activated and he will start breathing deeply, and he will also, his breathing rate will increase. But now his saturation of carbon dioxide is less. Heartbeat is faster because heartbeat takes a while to come down. It is controlled by autonomic nervous system, not directly by the medulla. So even if he has stopped running, it will take a while for the heartbeat to settle down. It's not under the direct medullary control like how your breathing is directly under the control of your pneumotaxic center, the dorsal respiratory, ventral respiratory, chemosensitive areas. So it takes a while for the heartbeat to settle down. Okay. So I want you to take up these remaining classwork questions, and the first 15 questions, as every week we've been doing the same thing. First 15 homework questions, you can take it up as your homework, and you know where to submit it, children. Do all the remaining classwork questions also. I've covered all the major parts in the chapter, so you must be able to solve the remaining parts also. Another thing from this chapter I want you to go through from the NCERT is pulmonary volumes. It's a very important match the following question in your NEET exam. Tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume. What are the formulas for inspiratory capacity, expiratory capacity, functional residual capacity, vital capacity, total lung capacity? Values are important and formulae are important. So that one thing I want you to do on your own. Okay, and submit the first 15 homework questions on your educator as homework for today's revision topic, breathing and exchange of gases.